Funny how people unsubscribe from your life without notice. One day they swear forever, the next they're gone. But hey, if you're here, hit subscribe. It's free, unlike loyalty. I had spent 5 years saving up $140,000 for my dream wedding. A breathtaking ceremony on the beach, where my husband and I had shared some of our happiest memories. We both loved the ocean, and I wanted nothing more than to exchange vows with the sound of the waves crashing behind us. It was going to be luxurious, a once-in-a-lifetime experience, not just for us but for our guests too. But that dream never happened. Instead, we got married in a quiet, private ceremony at my husband's aunt's farmhouse. It was beautiful in its own way, but it wasn't what I had envisioned. And it was all because my parents lied to me about something no child should ever have to question. A few months before our wedding, my mother called me, her voice filled with desperation. She told me my father had fallen seriously ill, his diabetes worsening to the point that he needed an expensive, specialized medication that had to be imported. Insurance wouldn't cover it, and they simply couldn't afford it. I didn't even think twice. I wired them $125,000, nearly everything I had saved, because what daughter wouldn't do that for her father? I visited them often, worried sick, but every time I asked to see medical documents, my mother dodged the question. My father was always in bed, but something felt off. He never looked as sick as she made it seem, and when I asked why he wasn't in a hospital, she brushed me off, saying it wasn't necessary. I wanted to believe them. But then I noticed something strange. My brother, who lived close by, never came to visit. I asked my father why, and he told me they didn't want to worry him. That didn't sit right with me. If Dad was so sick that he needed experimental medication, why wouldn't they tell his own son? So I called my brother. That's when everything unraveled. He sounded happy, too happy for someone whose father was supposedly battling a severe illness. And then, with no idea of what I had been told, he casually said, "I'll stop by as soon as we get back from our honeymoon." Honeymoon? I didn't even know they had left for one. My parents never mentioned it. My brother explained that he and his wife had been traveling around Europe for a month, enjoying a dream honeymoon, one that our parents had paid for. I felt my stomach drop. At first, I wanted to believe it was a misunderstanding. Maybe my parents had kept the truth from my brother so he wouldn't worry on his trip. But then he told me something that shattered everything. He said our parents had reassured him that Dad was completely fine. There was no medical emergency. No experimental medication. No insurance denial. Nothing. They had taken every penny I had saved for my wedding and funneled it into my brother's extravagant honeymoon, while I spent sleepless nights worried sick about my father. And the worst part? They had no idea that I knew. But they were about to find out. The moment my brother casually mentioned that our parents had fully funded his extravagant honeymoon, I knew exactly where my money had gone. The so-called medical emergency? A complete lie. My father had never been sick, never needed an expensive imported medication. Instead, my parents had stolen $125,000, money I had saved for years for my dream wedding, to send my brother and his wife on a luxury, month-long honeymoon. When I confronted my parents, they didn't even try to deny it. They simply shrugged and told me they had no choice, because they knew I wouldn't have given them the money if I had known the truth. They tricked me on purpose. Their reasoning? My brother had been struggling at work and feeling unhappy, so they wanted to give him something to look forward to. And since they didn't want to dip into their own retirement funds, they figured it was fine to steal from me instead. After all, I was still young, I had plenty of time to make the money back. I was speechless. They actually expected me to be grateful for this? They told me I should be happy that the trip had saved my brother from depression, as if that somehow justified everything. As if his happiness mattered more than mine. I demanded my money back, explaining that my wedding was just months away, and I had planned everything around that budget. I wasn't asking for extra, I just wanted back what was rightfully mine. But my parents? They refused. They told me they couldn't repay me before my wedding, it would take them years to pay me back. They expected me to just accept it, cut down my wedding plans and move on because family is more important than money. And yet, that logic only seemed to apply to me. Because when my brother went to college, they paid for everything. When I went to college, I had to choose. They told me they would either pay for my education or my future wedding, but not both. I never once questioned it, never complained. I worked hard, saved up for 5 years, and made sure I wouldn't be a burden to anyone. And now, all of that careful planning meant nothing, because my parents had decided that my brother deserved an all-expenses-paid honeymoon more than I deserved the wedding I had worked my ass off to afford. I had never felt so betrayed. But the worst part? When I begged them, literally begged, to give me my money back before the wedding. They looked me in the eye and said no. I walked out of their house in tears. And in that moment, I knew our relationship would never be the same again. When I told my husband the truth about what my parents had done, he was furious. He even wanted to take legal action. But as much as I wanted justice, I knew we had no case. There was no proof, no messages, no contracts. Nothing to confirm that my mother had lied about my father's medical emergency to steal my wedding fund. Everything had been verbal. Taking them to court would only drain us further. Instead, we had to figure out how to move forward. That's when my husband's family stepped in. His aunt offered us her beautiful farmhouse as a wedding venue, for free. It wasn't the beachfront wedding I had dreamed of, but the moment I saw it, I fell in love with the place. It felt peaceful, intimate, perfect. Suddenly, I realized that the money didn't matter. What mattered was us. So, we cut back on expenses and started reimagining our wedding, not as a grand spectacle, but as a gathering of people who truly loved and supported us. And you know what? It turned out even better than I had imagined. Then came my brother's phone call. At first, I had considered inviting him. After all, he wasn't the one who stole my money. He didn't even know my parents had lied to me. But the moment he opened his mouth, all doubt vanished. He didn't call to apologize. He called to scold me. Apparently, my mother had told him her version of the story, where I was the villain for daring to ask for my money back. He accused me of being selfish and humiliating our parents over something so small. Something so small? I had spent 5 years saving that money. It was supposed to be for my wedding. But instead, my parents had stolen it for his honeymoon. And now, here he was, telling me to suck it up and just adjust my expectations, because he promised to pay me back someday. That was it for me. I cut them all off. My parents? Not invited. My brother? Not invited. I made sure that no one told them when or where the wedding was. And once it was over, I finally felt free. I shared the photos online a few days later, thinking nothing of it. And then the messages started pouring in. My parents were furious. My brother was livid. They had just found out they weren't invited. And they were demanding an explanation. But the truth was they didn't deserve one. I was shocked that my family even expected an invitation to my wedding. Had they forgotten our last conversation? The way I left their house in tears after they stole my money? The way my brother blamed me instead of them? They hadn't tried to contact me once since then. And yet, now that the wedding had passed, they were suddenly outraged that they had been left out. They called me together, yelling, demanding answers, acting like they were the victims. But I was done. So I told them the truth. They stole my money, forcing me to cut down the wedding guest list. They weren't invited because they weren't family to me anymore. And then, I hung up and blocked them. But an hour later, my husband got a message. Apparently, my mom was so upset she cried until she almost fainted. For a moment, I felt guilty. But then I remembered. When I begged them to return my money, I was the one crying. I was the one hurting. And they didn't care. So why should I? I made one final decision. They were out of my life, permanently. But they wouldn't let it go. Even after I blocked them, they kept harassing my husband. At first, it was just messages demanding he talk some sense into me. Then they escalated. One day, as he was leaving work, he noticed a car following him. It was my parents and brother. They honked at him, forcing him to pull over. At this point, he knew that if he didn't deal with them now, they'd just show up at our home. So to get it over with, he agreed to meet them at a nearby diner. They pleaded their case, trying to guilt-trip him into convincing me to be a family again. They said, it was just borrowed money. We were always going to pay her back. She's overreacting, she needs to grow up. Family should always forgive. But my husband? He outplayed them. Instead of arguing, he pretended to be on their side. He told them that if they truly wanted to fix things, they needed to apologize, to admit what they did. And these absolute fools fell for it. They wrote everything down in a message, confessing to the entire scam. That was all we needed. We're taking them to court. The moment we got their written confession, we contacted our lawyer. We are officially suing them to get our $125,000 back. I worked for 5 years to save that money. I sacrificed sleep, I skipped vacations, I hustled, and they stole it for my brother's honeymoon. Now, they're going to pay. And the best part? My husband and I are finally going on our own honeymoon. It won't be some lavish, over-the-top vacation. Just a peaceful trip to the beach, a place that means something to us. Because happiness isn't about impressing others. It's about being with the people who actually love you. And my family? They made their choice. Now they'll have to live with it. What do you think? Have you ever been betrayed by your own family like this? Do you think I did the right thing by cutting them off and suing them? Tell me what you think in the comments. And if this story resonated with you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.